Okay, we are going to make a cast shadow now for Eddar's layer. A cast shadow falls in the opposite direction of the light source. So we've already talked about our light source coming from the top left. And we can use the clue here that we get from the shadow of the table that our shadows are going to go um, toward the right and maybe at a slight angle. Our shadows are basically a shape of ourselves. I mean, are shaped very similar to the object that is blocking the light. So we want a shadow that is shaped like Edder. So there's an easy way to make a selection that is the shape of something that's on a particular layer in Photo P. So the way we do that is we go to the layer where that object is, and this little picture here is called the thumbnail on the layer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the control button on my keyboard, and I'm going to click on the thumbnail of the Edder layer. And what you see is a selection that is exactly the shape of everything that is on the Edder layer because I want my shadow to be exactly the shape of Edder. Right, so that is on the Edder layer. I'm going to make a new blank layer by clicking the new layer button. It's going to pop up in my layer stack right above the Edder layer because that was the layer I just had active. So this is labeled layer 77. And our shadow, we're going to make our shadow be black. So I've got black is my paint color in my toolbox. And I'm going to use the paint bucket in my toolbox. And I'm going to click on that new blank layer into that selection spot. And when I do that, the entire spot will fill in with black from the paint. So it's a complete silhouette. If you notice when I hide that layer by clicking on the eyeball, I see Edder because he's on the layer below, but this is a solid black image. If you use the paint bucket and what you see are kind of splotches or spots on Edder, what you are doing is using the paint bucket on the actual photo of Edder and not a new blank layer that is separate from Edder. So make sure that you do that. You can always undo things if you find that you've made a mistake. So here we have our silhouette. The shadow is going to be behind Edder. So what I'm going to do to start off with is I'm going to take the shadow layer in the layer stack and I'm going to drag it below the Edder layer. So now we see Edder as opposed to the shadow. If I hide the eyeball on the Edder layer, you still see the shadow. So I'm still on that layer 77 where I put the shadow. Now I'm going to basically push this shadow onto the ground. And I'm going to do that by going to Edit, Transform, Distort, because Distort's going to give me a lot of control, again, over different parts. So I'm going to begin by grabbing the center anchor point on this box, and I'm just going to push straight down, and that's going to squish and push this, condense it down to the ground. While it's still in this transform state, I can move it. So I'm going to move it up a little bit so that it's touching Edder's foot. Now I'm going to take the top left anchor point and drag it sideways a little bit. I'm going to do the same thing with the top right anchor point, drag it sideways a little bit to kind of show that shift of light off to an angle, kind of a similar angle that we have for the table. Okay, and then once I feel like it's on the ground where I want it to be, I'm going to condense it a little bit this way. I'm going to hit the Enter key on my keyboard to finish off that transformation. So now the shadow is down on the floor. It's in the right position, but it still doesn't look quite right. So we're going to do a couple of things to that to still adjust the shadow. First thing I'm going to do is get rid of that selection around the shadow. So I'm going to go up to Select and to Deselect to get rid of that. I'm going to move the shadow a little bit more to make sure the foot is underneath, the foot of the shadow is underneath the foot of Eder. I'm just going to point this out now. I have like a residual outline here, and I think it's because I didn't remove my selection before I transformed Eder, but I'm just going to keep going. You just might notice that, but I'm just going to keep going with what we're doing here. All right, so first of all, what's unnatural about this shadow, it's in the right position, but what's unnatural about it is that it's way too opaque. It's too dark. It's too solid. We can control the opacity, which is how solid something is, of a layer by going up to the top right on the layer panel box. You see opacity, there's a little triangle next to it. You click on that and it brings up a slider. So I'm going to slide down the opacity, and as I do that, you can start to see the floor underneath it. So I'm going to about 17%. More than paying attention to the percentage, you should pay attention to how this shadow looks compared to the shadow that's already in the setting of the room. So it looks like it's about at that same range. So I'm going to leave the opacity at 17%. So that helps our shadow look a little bit more natural. But the other thing that we see with the shadows is that the shadows that are already in the room have kind of a softer edge, and Eder's shadow is pretty hard edge, pretty clean edge. So we want to make an adjustment for that. And what we're going to do for that is blur it. So we're going to go to filter, down to blur, and over to Gaussian blur. Gaussian blur is like an overall blur. You see the little slider come up. We don't want it to be so blurry that we don't see it anymore, but we don't want the edges to be sharp. So I'm going to just move it into like the 2.5 pixel range. It's just adjusting the edges there. So it looks a little softer. And I would say that that's a pretty realistic cast shadow. The other kind of shadow that we have is a balance point shadow, and that's a shadow that we put underneath an object where it touches another object. So the place that Eder touches another object is where his foot touches the floor. There's nothing else of Eder that's touching another object. So we do need a balance point shadow underneath his foot. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here just so you can see better. So that you have control over the different areas, you should make another new blank layer. So I'm going to make another layer by clicking down my layer palette there on that new layer icon. So I've got layer 78. I'm going to take a paintbrush. Mine's kind of small, could be a little bit smaller, but I'm going to soften the edges of it a little bit. What I'm going to do basically is I'm drawing a line, and the line is partly hidden by Eder's layer. So there's my shadow, there's my Eder's layer, here's my new blank layer. On the new blank layer, I'm going to draw a line, and just the little bottom edge of it is going to peek out underneath Eder's shoe. So it's kind of maybe a little too big in some places. I can erase it or adjust it, because what it really is just a black line. So if I hide Eder's layer, you can see it's just a black line. I'm going to go and clean up that line a little bit, smooth it out a little bit. And while my shadow looks a little bit too big, I can easily move the shadow. By switching to my move tool and just kind of adjusting it. I just pulled it up a little bit. So there's the shadow. And if I want to, I can, balance point shadow is supposed to be pretty dark, but I can lower the opacity a little bit. I can maybe blur it just a little bit if I think it needs it. That's too much blur, but maybe just a little. Okay, some balance point shadows are meant to be super dark and wouldn't necessarily need that. But So that is Eddar's cast shadow, Eddar's balance point shadow, and we already did the lighting on him.